My brother married my fiancée after he slandered me, accusing me of infidelity. My mother then declared that this woman had never been my match. After that, I disappeared. Years later, I arrived at a family meeting in a car worth $200,000, while their old wreck had stalled just 2 blocks from the gathering place. So that you understand the essence of what happened, I will present the facts in order, because without the background, this situation might seem meaningless. At the age of 28, I worked as a design engineer at a company dealing with medium-scale urban infrastructure. Such work does not elicit enthusiastic cheers at parties, but it is well paid, meaningful to society, and perfect for a person with systematic thinking. I was a professional in my field, and loved finding solutions that eliminate a problem forever. Sila was a ceramic artist. She owned a small studio, had a circle of loyal clients, and could describe glaze for her pieces as if she were speaking about a living being. We met at an exhibition in a gallery of a mutual acquaintance. I knew nothing about ceramics, and she knew nothing about calculating load-bearing structures. That was enough for our relationship to last 4 years. We got engaged 8 months before my entire familiar existence was destroyed. There was nothing theatrical about the proposal, just the two of us, a kitchen table, and a ring I had chosen for 3 months. She said yes before I even finished my sentence. My brother is 2 years older than me. I want to be extremely precise in describing him, without turning him into a caricature of a villain. He was far more dangerous. Arlen possessed that specific charm characteristic of people lacking an inner core. He was incredibly adaptable and always showed those around him exactly the version of himself they wanted to see at that moment. He ran a commercial real estate brokerage firm called Crestmark Property Group. It was a growing company whose success rested solely on personal connections and the appearance of reliability. My brother deeply understood only one thing: external effects. Everything else was borrowed. My mother loved him with that blind and absolute love that some parents give their firstborn without any checks or doubts. To my face, she never called me secondary, but her actions over 3 decades said the opposite. I came to terms with this fact just as one comes to terms with the weather. The evening when it all happened was an ordinary family gathering with relatives and neighbors. Sila and I were relaxed, as we saw no reason for concern. About an hour after it started, Arlen stood up and announced that he needed to address an important matter. His voice sounded restrained and feignedly remorseful, as if the upcoming confession was difficult for him. He took out his phone and began showing everyone screenshots. It was a correspondence allegedly from my number with some woman, the content of which was intimate enough to break off the engagement. There were even photos with timestamps that looked like irrefutable proof. Then a woman named Rena, whom I had briefly seen in Arlen's professional circle, stepped forward. She claimed that 2 months earlier, she had seen me leaving a hotel with an unknown woman. She accurately described my jacket, my car, and named a specific date. The atmosphere in the room changed in 90 seconds. That is exactly how long it takes people who have known you for years to completely restructure their opinion of you and turn it into something ugly. I looked at Sila. Her face expressed neither anger nor pain. It simply went blank. That was much worse than tears. Behind her eyes, a door seemed to quietly close. She took the ring out of her pocket and placed it on the table in front of her, not even looking in my direction. I tried to speak, but managed only a few words before Arlen interrupted me. He was not shouting, but he spoke loudly enough to command the attention of everyone present. I felt that the verdict had already been delivered. My mother stood next to my brother and looked at me with an expression on her face that I remember to this day. There was no cruelty in her gaze, only absolute certainty. She said that Sila had never been my match, as if correcting an insignificant factual error. I stayed in that room for about another 30 seconds. No one came to my defense. No one asked a single clarifying question. Sila stared at the table, while Arlen had already resumed his role as master of the situation, steering the conversation back to its usual course. I took my jacket, walked out the door, and did not look back. That was the last time they saw me as the person they took me for. As I drove out of the yard and headed north, I felt neither anger nor grief. I was driven by cold calculation. I drove for 6 hours in complete silence, because I needed space for clear thinking. By the time I crossed the state line, I had already formulated a certain plan of action. I settled in the city of Halverton, a medium-sized industrial center where no one asks unnecessary questions about your past. Within 3 weeks, I got a job at an engineering consultancy, introducing myself by my middle name and my mother's maiden name combined into a new surname, Kaler Van. This was completely legal, but it made me invisible to those who did not know exactly what to look for. The first 4 months were extremely difficult. The longing for Sila manifested unexpectedly, for example, while inspecting work sites or late at night. It pained me to realize that something real had been destroyed by artificially constructed lies. I coped with this in the only way available to me. I worked, observed, and documented. Arlen's firm, Crestmark Property Group, had a noticeable online presence. I began systematically studying all available information about his business. As an engineer, I understood that any structure has stress concentration points. If you find those vulnerable spots, you can understand how the whole system works. Within 12 months of quiet research, I discovered a serious problem hidden within the property valuation process at my brother's company. Properties were appraised above market value for certain clients, and the inflated commissions were secretly funneled through a shell company registered in another state. It was fraud that worked only because no one checked the details. But I checked. I did not take active action, I just collected evidence. Each entry was time-stamped and sourced. Within 18 months, that file became flawless. In parallel, using 3 levels of legal investment instruments under the name Kaler Van, I began buying minority stakes in the holding companies of Crestmark. These were small positions that did not require mandatory disclosure and looked like ordinary portfolio diversification for a successful consultant. By the 22nd month, these stakes had turned into a significant share package. My brother had effectively sold part of his business to the very person he had tried to erase from his life. I found out that Arlen and Sila were now together by chance, from an acquaintance who was not part of our family circle. I acknowledged this information and continued working. I did not spend every minute thinking about revenge. I was building a new life. Kaler Van had a career, a bright apartment, and colleagues he respected. My patience was not a game. I simply stopped wasting energy on people who had already formed a false opinion of me. However, I continued to update the evidence file and increase my stake in the company, tracking Crestmark's trajectory as carefully as any load-bearing structure. One day, a letter arrived at my parents' address, which was forwarded to me by a cousin who had kept my contact. It was an invitation to the annual family gathering in the same house and the same format. My name was still on the guest list after 3 years. I do not know whether this was an oversight or something else, but it did not matter. I read the invitation twice, opened my investment summary and the file with the fraud documents. Everything was ready. My positions were solid, and the evidence was exhaustive. The situation resembled a structure awaiting its calculated load. I opened my email and sent my confirmation of attendance. Choosing an expensive car was not an act of ego or a desire to show off. It was information that I intended to convey to those present. For 3 years, I had been building a narrative about who I am and who he is. Any version of events depends on facts. I did not come to impress anyone. My goal was to prove within the first 30 seconds. The version of me that they had buried did not reflect the whole truth. My obsidian-colored car had a restrained design. Such a vehicle does not announce itself loudly. There is no need for that. I had owned it for 8 months. This car suited Kaler Van just as well as his work. Precise, functional, and far more significant than it appears at first glance. I parked 2 blocks from the house. Not for drama. I needed 60 seconds to observe before entering. I saw more than I expected. Arlen's car had stalled by the curb near a neighbor's driveway. An old domestic sedan with rust on the wheel arches, a clear sign that maintenance had long been neglected. A mobile mechanic was squatting by the front wheel. Arlen was standing over him, waving his arms. He always did that when he was losing an argument he could not afford to lose publicly. Broad gestures, as if active gesticulation could change the mechanical reality of the breakdown. Sila sat in the passenger seat. The door was closed. She was looking at her phone with that particular calm of a person who had long stopped participating in a situation and was simply waiting for it to end. I watched for about 20 seconds. Then I walked past them at a leisurely pace and went inside. Several relatives whom I barely knew noticed me at the entrance. They reacted the way people usually react when a face seems familiar, but the context has changed. One of my father's cousins squinted, recognized me, and said my name with a questioning tone. I replied, "Long time no see," shook his hand and kept walking. I had not come here for small talk. My mother was at the other end of the room. She noticed me instantly. I saw emotions flicker across her face, recognition, and then something I could not precisely define. Not quite guilt, more the discomfort of a person confronted with consequences that he had convinced himself would never come. She did not move toward me. I did not go to her. I held her gaze just long enough to confirm that I had seen her, and then I looked away first. On my own terms, I took a place in the back of the main hall, picked up a drink that I did not touch, and began to listen as the atmosphere in the room restored itself. They entered about 15 minutes later. I heard Arlen before I saw him, that familiar tone of a person feigning ease in company, louder than necessary, filling the space in advance. Since our last meeting, he had gained weight. Not too much, but noticeably, as happens when a person stops striving for anything and simply starts consuming. Sela walked half a step behind. She looked tired, and it was not due to the late hour. Her style had changed. It contained less of her and more of what, I assumed, our circle expected. She scanned the attendees the way people do at unwanted events, trying to find a familiar face. And she found one. Our eyes met, and she froze. Not from fear, but she simply stopped, like a system receiving data it cannot process. I watched her gaze, and I saw the realization reach him in stages. First, confusion, then a reassessment of the situation, and then that very look he always resorted to. Control, management, an attempt to seize the room's attention. He was about to speak. I spoke first, quietly. I did not need to shout. I simply said her name. Sela. Evenly, without haste. The way you name something you never truly lost. The silence in the room did not come all at once, but like a wave, starting from us and radiating outward, until the only sound was a glass clinking against a hard surface. Arlen stepped forward, clenching his jaw and squaring his shoulders, ready to dominate, as always. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket, gripped the tablet I had brought with me, and for the first time that evening, I smiled. Arlen's first move was predictable. He laughed, not genuinely but performatively, warmly, with a hint of feigned disbelief, playing to the audience. He spread his hands and looked around at those present, inviting them to share in the absurdity of the moment. 3 years, he said. Nothing. No calls, no contact, and now you just show up. He had already begun reframing my presence as a problem, forcing the room to focus on the audacity of my appearance rather than its cause. He had done this his whole life, and it worked because no one was ready. I let him finish, then took out the tablet and placed it on the dining table. Sit down, I said quietly. I said it the way you state the calculation of a load-bearing structure, which will not change no matter what those around you think. He did not sit, but he stopped moving. I opened the first document and turned the screen toward the room. This was not a performance. This was a report. There is a certain style of speech that develops after many years of delivering assessments to municipal councils. Clear, sequential, without unnecessary words. That is exactly what I used. The screenshots you showed 3 years ago were taken from a fabricated correspondence created via an anonymous account. That profile was registered to a prepaid card purchased at a store 3 blocks from the old Crestmark office on Dollar Street. I have the purchase record and a timestamp. I also have the Crestmark client visitation log for that same week, showing that you were in that area on 2 of the 3 relevant days. Someone in the back of the room made a sound. I continued. The witness, Rena, was paid $3,000, approximately 10 days before that gathering. That payment came through a shell company called Halver Solutions. That company has no employees, no commercial activity, and only one beneficial owner. I paused. I have the registration documents. Arlen's jaw tensed. He tried to speak, but I continued, without raising my voice. Halver Solutions is also one of the entities through which Crestmark funneled inflated commissions for the past 4 years. Property appraisals were deliberately overvalued by between 18 and 31% above market value, and the difference was quietly routed through Halver before ending up in a personal account. Complete silence filled the room. I scrolled to the next page of the document. At the top of the ownership registry is the name Kaler Van. I have been a minority shareholder in Crestmark's holding structure for 2.5 years. 14 months ago, that position turned into a controlling stake. This means that the company, including the accounts linked to Halver, has been owned by me for over a year. I watched as Arlen's face changed rapidly. I had seen that sequence before, in structures under a load they were not designed to bear. "This is not," he began. "You can't just—" He stopped, changed tactics, and turned to the room, raising his voice. "This is fake. He disappeared for 3 years and now comes back with some papers he put together himself." I replied, "4 days ago, I submitted the complete fraud dossier to the relevant regulatory authority. It contains 63 pages of supporting documentation. Investigators have confirmed receipt." Silence fell. Not polite silence, but structural silence. The kind that occurs when something fundamental has shifted, and everyone feels it, but no one has moved yet. I looked at Arlen. He was still standing, but the very quality of his posture had completely changed. His shoulders, his jaw, everything. My mother stood at the edge of the room, pressing her palm against the wall, as if she needed support. Sela had not moved from the moment I said her name. Then I crossed the room in 4 steps. My phone on the table vibrated. I looked at the screen, picked it up, and turned it so Arlen could read the message from the Crestmark Board of Directors' attorney. "Legal proceedings have commenced." Arlen read the text twice. I know this because I watched his eyes. A pause, then a second reading. His grip on my arm did not release immediately. It simply lost its meaning. There is a difference between someone holding you and someone who simply forgot to let go. By the time he removed his hand, it was the second case. He stepped back, looked at the room, then at me, performed the same calculation I had made 3 years ago, and arrived at the same conclusion. There was no scenario in which he could justify himself. Not today. Not when 63 pages were already in the regulator's office. Nevertheless, he tried. "He set all this up," he said, and his voice sounded different. The acting remained, but something inside had cracked. "Don't you see what he's doing? He disappears for 3 years, gathers some case, and shows up here to what? Humiliate the family?" Several people stirred. Not toward him. They just shifted their postures, the way weight redistributes when a foundation begins to move. "You fabricated the evidence," I said. "That is not an accusation. It is a clarification. And you paid someone to confirm it in front of everyone in this room 3 years ago." No one uttered a word. And then Sela spoke. She had not moved from where she stood. Her voice was so soft that those present had to lean in slightly to hear her, and everyone did. "I knew something was wrong," she said. Arlen turned to her. "Sela, don't." She replied without malice, just a word, placed in his path like a closed door. She was looking at. The admission that my entire existence had been built on a lie would have meant that I had willingly given up something genuine. It was far easier to believe the version of events that did not require trusting my own intuition. She did not ask for forgiveness, nor did she wait for my reaction. It was a confession in the purest sense, spoken only because it needed to be said, not for any response. I looked at her for a short while, then gave a short nod. That gesture meant, "I know, and now this is your burden, not mine." I surveyed the room again, one last attempt at justification. "She's upset. She doesn't know what she's saying." "Be quiet," my mother interrupted him. She had crossed the living room without my noticing, and now stood only 3 feet away. Her appearance was that of a person who had finally completed a calculation she had avoided for years. There was no melodrama or excess emotion in her, only emptiness and finality. She stared into my face for a long time. "I should have listened to you," she said. I held her gaze, not trying to fill the silence with comfort or grant her the forgiveness she so awaited. "Yes," I replied, "you should have." She accepted this silently, without argument. Outside, in front of the window, I noticed movement. A dark sedan pulled smoothly to the curb, and 2 people in strict business suits got out. They were in no hurry. Their postures held that particular patience of people who already know how this evening will end. I had arranged their arrival time 4 days ago. It was the official delivery of the notices of proceedings. First the civil suit, and then the already initiated mechanism of criminal prosecution. I picked up the tablet from the table and headed for the exit. But someone's hand again grabbed my elbow, this time tighter, with the strength that only desperation gives. I stopped and looked at his fingers on my sleeve, then slowly moved my gaze to him. The way you look at an object already accounted for in your plans. "Let go," I said calmly, without raising my voice. The people outside stepped toward the porch. Arlen released his fingers, not because I physically intimidated him. There was no need for that. He let me go because the guests on the path knocked, and the sound echoed through the house like a timestamp. The moment took clear shape, and Arlen felt its boundaries. I opened the door myself. The tall woman from the pair introduced herself and handed over a sealed package, the official notice of the initiated process, the filed civil complaint, and an appendix regarding the transfer of the case to criminal proceedings. She behaved professionally, was brief, and completely indifferent to the fact that she was dismantling a 3-year architecture of lies in front of the entire family in just 40 minutes. I took the envelope. Arlen stood nearby, gripping the papers with both hands, as if unsure what to do with this weight. I walked past him and out into the evening cool. The Crestmark group of companies was effectively paralyzed within 48 hours. The regulatory authorities worked even faster than I had anticipated. This confirmed that my dossier was flawless. Arlen's licenses were sent for review within a week. The clients with whom he had built relationships for years through dinner parties and social connections stopped answering calls as soon as the investigation became public. That is how things work in industries built on trust and surface polish. As soon as the facade cracks, trust does not linger to find out what lies beneath. The collapse was not loud. Everything contracted quietly and methodically, like structures fall when the load finally exceeds their real limit. Sela's situation resolved on a different plane. Her ceramics business depended on our social network far more than she realized. Gallery contacts, collector recommendations, event participation. When that network disappeared, all her promotion channels closed. Let me be clear, she was not destroyed, but she was sent back to the very beginning. Now she had to build everything on her own, without outside support or an artificially constructed reputation. Whether she could create something real from that position is her own matter, not mine. I had no desire to see her fail, but her story was no longer to intersect with mine. My mother called 3 weeks later. I listened to her to the end. She spoke restrainedly, without tears or unnecessary emotion, which earned my respect. She admitted her fault and said that all this time she had known the scale of what she had allowed to happen 3 years ago. I waited until she finished, then replied, "You made your choice that same night, just like everyone else. I made mine later." She paused for a moment, then asked if there was a way back. "I don't know yet," I answered, but this was the right beginning. I was not lying to her or trying to shut the door. I was simply honestly indicating its actual location, not where both of us might wish it to be. I think, somewhere deep down, she understood that. The next morning, I left for Halverton. I returned to the consulting firm, to Darvish's terrible coffee, to infrastructure assessments, and to the life that Kaler Van had built in the space cleared after everything unnecessary had been cut away. The work continued successfully, the apartment still had plenty of light, and my name still fit me perfectly. I often think about what people expect from such stories. They want rage, dramatic speeches, or a moment when the hero cries in his car, looking at the wreckage of the past. I had none of that. I felt only deep satisfaction from a system that worked exactly as it had been designed. Every variable was accounted for. The load was distributed correctly. The result was not random luck. It was an inevitability. The world finally reflected the truth that had always been nearby, waiting only for someone to stop arguing with it and simply collect the evidence. They thought my disappearance was weakness, but it was a strategic move. Silence did not mean absence. It was a process of construction. I returned to that house, not for reconciliation, but because the structure was ready. I only had to show up and let it do its work. As I left, I closed the door behind me, not slamming it but firmly, the way you close something that is finished forever.